hit Facebook Live, Twitter Live, YouTube Live. So let's get this show on the road. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will talk about protection of human rights and civil rights of the diverse Asian American and Pacific Islander communities with our special guest, Aarti Kohli, Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice and the Asian Law Caucus. A reminder to our Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results, and questions submitted to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So Aarti, thank you so much for joining us. This topic could not be more timely. We've all been reading about the various attacks, some of them just really heinous, directed against elderly, Asian men and women walking on the street, basically sucker punches and just really terrible behavior. And also sometimes the witnesses are exhibiting just a callous disregard of their fellow Americans. Could you talk a little bit about your organization, its origins, and let's talk about this issue, which is not new to the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here, Mark. Yeah, my organization is Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. We're the first Pan-Asian civil rights organization in the country, and we were formed in 1972, and by the children and grandchildren of folks who were interned under Japanese internment, and so we do have a long history of anti-Asian discrimination in this country, and going back hundreds of years. If you go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act. And Asian Americans were referred to as the yellow peril. And that was actually, we were seen as a public health threat at that time. And South Asians were referred to as the dusky peril. There was even a riot in Bellingham, Washington, where all the South Asian workers were literally, railroaded out of town. That led to that interpersonal hate and discrimination, led to policies in this country that basically prevented our immigration for 50 years. And it prevented us from becoming full citizens. You had the alien land laws in California aimed at Japanese Americans, so they could not own land to farm. And when you fast forward to internment during World War II, where Japanese Americans were, their loyalty was questioned, they were seen as a national security threat only because of their national origin. There was no other, evidence of disloyalty. This narrative of us as perpetual foreigners continues. And then you fast forward to the 80s when we had the decline in our auto industry. You had in the 1980s, the brutal murder of Vincent Chin, who was killed by 2 auto workers who thought he was Japanese American. As it turned out, he was Chinese American, but they beat him to death. And, that was a moment in time where the Asian American community really galvanized. And you see at that moment, some of the nonprofits that are around now, came into being in terms of, advocacy on behalf of Asian Americans. Go ahead.
Part of the issue that we have is an American issue. And part of the issue is just a human issue. If you look at the founding of this country, so much is connected with identity and race and religion. The yearning to be free was also a yearning for identity, which had its dark side, which meant identity was white and European. And then you take a look at us as people, all of us, and each of us carries some burden, right? And if you take a look at the diverse Asian communities, they're community tensions, because Asian community is not one thing, right? You have the tensions between people of Japanese extraction and Korean extraction and Chinese extraction and all those complexities, Filipino extraction. How do we deal with the idea of race and identity in the United States such that we are one people, Americans, regardless as to the tone of our skin or our national origin? How do we actually overcome our own individual inclinations to see somebody and have a thought based on their appearance?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it's a question we're facing as a society that at its origin is rooted in white supremacy, right? That was the justification for, taking the land away from indigenous people. That was the justification for slavery, right? And so when it's in our origin, it's something that we have to really work hard to get rid of. And we have to acknowledge that while there is interpersonal and implicit bias that we all carry, we are part of systems that are set up under white supremacy, right? The police came into being in the beginning because they were catching runaway slaves, and so you can't get away from the origins of some of our systems. So I think we have to attack it both systemically, and then I think there are things that we have to do to teach people each other's histories. So, we support, ethnic studies curricula for K through 12 kids. Because if the kids don't understand each other's history, how are they supposed to, accept each other? And so these are important things that we have to do systemically in our society. And I think one of the interesting things I'm noticing is that people are much more willing to talk about race. There was a time when it was taboo. And I think we have to acknowledge the racial hierarchies and inequities before we can actually even tackle them.
I'm not sure that I buy the what you're saying completely.
Okay.
I think that we have too many narratives that seem to be in opposition to each other, and they really ought to be more inclusive. So, for example, the idea that police were founded in order to catch runaway slaves is true, but it's also not the entire story. Police were also founded to protect property. Were also founded to investigate inner city crime and keep the peace in urban populations. There were a number of different stories that can be told about the founding of police. Police were also founded in order to protect the railways from their own workers, who were very often
striking.
Striking and Asian workers, right? So there are a lot of different stories.
Absolutely.
There is not just sort of one truth. And the same thing with racism, right? There is a strain of white supremacism in the United States, but there are also strains of supremacism or this idea of superiority based in race that are infecting human beings across the board.
Oh, yeah.
End up dealing with the issue today of anti-Asian violence that seems to be coming from economic interests, tensions, an attempt for political gain. How do we end up converting people into an idea that allows them to embrace Americans that look differently from themselves? That me as a white person can see an Asian person walking down the street and think that is a fellow citizen. How do we deal with that? Can we legislate it? Do we do it through our educational system?
I mean, you can't legislate acceptance. I mean, I think narrative and culture change is what is one of the keys, right? When you think about the LGBTQ movement, right, in their trajectory of being vilified, and now, there is, I think, across the board, a lot of acceptance and embracing of LGBTQ folks. And you see that part of what needed to happen is people needed to acknowledge that these were our neighbors, these were our children, these were our friends, and these were folks who were human beings, right? They were not the other. So, you can have a framing that these people are the other, which is what you had politicians doing last year. And actually for many in the past few years, one of the challenges for immigrants and even second or third generation is that, you're constantly identified with your country of origin, right? And you're not seen as American. And so if we have a foreign policy issue with another country, that comes back to bite communities here. And so that's a really hard challenge. And part of what needs to happen is people need to know we are human beings who are here, have a long history of being here. And this idea of what is America is also needs to change, right? For some people, they feel a lot of threat, right? That America is shifting. We're shifting into a majority minority country. I think that's hard for folks who are used to being, thinking of America as a country of mainly, white people. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of narrative inclusion. And that can't be legislated, right?
But there is a piece that is also about legislation.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. And we're doing that work.
So let's talk about the legal work that you do in order to first protect, because if people can't be protected, people can't walk on the street in freedom, there is no freedom, right? So talk a little bit about the work that you do on a day-to-day basis to push back racism, anti-Asian racism in this country.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of legal work in a range of issues, like, whether it's protecting low-income tenants from eviction, workers' rights, getting Asian workers who don't speak English access to benefits, and that work has been, ongoing for a long time. We protect Asian Americans from deportation, all that work, and then now, we've really had to look for solutions for safety, because if you talk to folks on the ground, they won't actually disclose the hate that's coming at them. They don't feel comfortable going to the police.
There's a real reluctance, right? I mean, that comes from histories, not only that their families might have suffered before they came to the United States, but after coming to the United States, very often anti-Asian hatred and violence has just been ignored by law enforcement.
Yeah, and then, some people, we have a growing undocumented Asian community in this country. There's over 1 million undocumented Asians. And so if your immigration status, is at risk, you're concerned about going to the police. And so there are all these factors, language being a big one, and so one of the programs that we're looking at promoting and seeing if we can get more support for our community ambassador programs. So this idea being that you have folks in the community who are culturally competent, who aren't showing up in, with big law enforcement kind of, uniforms, but they're there to walk with you and be visible to you if you need help. And so, that's one of the programs that we feel like could be useful for our community. We're also, one of the other challenges is, the vast majority of incidents, fortunately, but, tragically, don't actually rise to the level of crime. So what happens is people do call the police and the police say, well, we can't do anything.
Right.
And so but that doesn't leave, I mean, that leaves the victim still feeling traumatized. No one has recognized the harm that has come at them when somebody spat at them or, harassed them. And so what kind of programs can we offer for these people to go to, to get support? Are there mental health support services? People get scared, they don't want to leave their home. Are there other, in some victims, even if you're the victim of a crime, if you don't file a police report, let's say the perpetrator flees and you have no idea who this person is, you can't access a victim's compensation fund, even if you end up in the hospital. And so we've got to make these, these services and systems that are in place available. And then we've got to experiment with new programs that are actually going to meet the needs of our communities.
We just completed a poll where we asked, do you believe that recent violence targeting Asian Americans was encouraged by racist or anti-Asian rhetoric? And 95% of the people responded answered in the affirmative. Do you believe that our leaders given license by characterizing this disease as having an ethnic origin, and some of the anti-Chinese rhetoric, just as the rhetoric.
Absolutely.
Do you believe that actually has resulted? Is there a cause and effect relationship between that and the attacks that have happened on the streets recently?
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I'm South Asian, so I saw what happened post 9/11. Anybody who was perceived to be Muslim, you have Sikhs and other folks and Muslims were harmed and killed, even shot at gas stations. And so, actually I started an Asian American Leaders Table to address COVID-19 racism a year ago, to gather leaders from across the country to address this, because I could see it coming.
Right.
And one of, we did scenario planning, and one of the scenarios we planned for was a shooting. I mean, and I was just really, heartbroken when the shooting happened in Atlanta. And I just, the history has taught us what happens to groups when they are being targeted, by political leaders, and, calling it the Kung flu, the Wuhan virus, all of that stuff had a real impact on communities here.
Yeah. So when we talk about countering these issues, you mentioned some of the legal work that you've done. You mentioned advocacy. You mentioned sort of bridge building between people who might have distrust of authority based in their own experience, and their own history, and the authorities themselves. What kind of a responsibility do members of the community themselves, because various Asian communities have a reputation of being sort of this sort of model minority,
yeah,
or keeping quiet, keeping your head down, and so on. How important is it to speak up, whether it's in entertainment, comedy, speaking out as political advocates, speaking out in legislatures,
private sector, corporations? Yeah.
How important is that?
It's incredibly important. And we're doing bystander intervention trainings for a lot of partners. And those are trainings about how to safely and comfortably intervene. And there are different levels of interventions that individuals can engage in. And it's also trainings for if something happens to you. And so we found that there is interest in a lot of different sectors for those trainings. I think Asian Americans need to hear from their neighbors, their employers, their communities, that they are welcome and people care for them. There's no bigger trauma than having first being harmed. We have a hate tracker, and so we get these reports. And actually, the hate started in 2016. When you saw the anti-China rhetoric being ramped up, the hate, also started. It really got worse under COVID, but even before then, there was a report I'm in the Bay Area, which is kind of seen as a liberal bastion, right? You would think, oh, there's a lot of, inclusion here, but there's a report of a woman in a coffee shop where, she was, somebody was attacking her verbally and telling her to go back to her country, and she was surrounded by people who said nothing, nothing. And, she was shocked, like first at the hate that came at her, and then the fact that nobody stood up for her.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a matter of voice, right? None of us are bystanders. We're all involved. And so acting as if there's any way to duck responsibility, either by not speaking up or by allowing these incidents to go past, we bear responsibility for that. There was a question that was just completed on another poll. Has racism against Asian Americans been used for political advantage among certain voters? And 73% of the respondents said yes. Now, let's say that's true. It really does beg the question of who the voters are who will vote based on racist tropes, right? Who are those people who will allow their voices either to be silenced or who will feel that they have license now because they've been given permission to be racist and therefore will vote for that person? Who are we as Americans? How do you counter that acceptability of racism in the United States? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a range of practices that we need to engage in to deal with the racism. And I think one thing is to counter it by actually giving voting rights and power to people who don't feel that way. And so one of the things that we've engaged in for a long time as a community is nonpartisan get out the vote, work with Asian American communities. And we did it nationally. For example, in Georgia, we really activated the Asian American vote there in this past election in partnership with our folks at Advancing Justice Atlanta. And you see that giving Asian Americans an outlet and the power to exercise their civic rights is a way to counter the racist voting. And one of the things I'm really concerned about are these laws, the voter suppression laws that are coming out now for example, in Georgia, and we're looking at legal challenges to those laws.
So it's really a matter of learning activism, learning how to assert as Americans one's voice. Our landlord here in San Francisco is a veteran of World War II and Korea, long serving military man. And I was talking with his daughter the other day, and she was saying, when I was younger, I was very active. And then we talked about our kids and how that activism seems to have dissipated with prosperity. And with a sense of complacence, a sense of acceptance, particularly in urban areas. She was basically opining that we really do need to start thinking about our role as citizens and our duty as citizens to be civically engaged in shaping America. And if we cede that territory, that territory ends up getting taken by people who have other views. What is your view of how we ought to involve ourselves as Americans in the civil society of the country? Can we just prosper and just leave that to other people who are more professionally engaged, or is that the responsibility of us all?
No, absolutely. We can't do it alone. As someone who's professionally engaged in protecting our democracy, I can tell you that we need all of us involved in this effort. And you can see, from just even this past year, how our democracy can be very fragile. We've got to work hard to make sure that we reinforce these structures that we've built over many years. And so, absolutely, I think, there is a role for government. We can't, we've got to protect that. We've got to demand both accountability from the government and also protect it. And so it's this interesting balance that we're always striking as advocates. And what I see now is, which is very heartening, is an incredible amount of activism coming out of the youth. And there is, I think they have less sort of preconceived notions, and they are very, already embracing sort of intersectional analyses. Like, the youth, I think, are very comfortable with working across different racial groups and other identities. And I think there's a lot of hope there of directing that energy towards social change.
We just took another poll and we asked, do you believe that Asian Americans are sufficiently organized to effectively counter racism against Asians in the United States? And 71% said no.
I agree.
How do we, so youth are more accustomed to working across different divisions, but it's very difficult in the Asian community if you consider Chinese ethnic groups, right, from different parts of China in the United States, Japanese, Korean,
well,
right?
Yeah.
Vietnamese,
So
right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no.
South Asian, right?
Yeah,
How do
right.
you come
Yeah.
together?
Well, because Asian is a political identity. It's a political identity. It's not a language group. It's not a country that people come from, right?
Right.
It's a political identity. And we actually, the case that's being made to our communities, and I think they understand this, is we have more power together, right? And that we do have certain cultural things in common. And we have a certain, we have the policies in this country that were aimed at our communities in common. And so we actually have to build power together. And one of the reasons we aren't as organized as we need to be is we haven't been invested in. We've been historically small groups. We're the fastest growing minority in this country. We'll be 10% of the population by 2050. That's huge. And so now is the time to invest in our communities. Now is the time to do the hard work of bringing us together. And that's part of what we're trying to do.
So part of this is becoming more sophisticated about the compromises that we need to make in order to become politically more potent, right? It's understanding that we might have differences, but the commonality of interests really should trump that. And making those compromises so that joint action can be taken on the most important issues is really important. It all starts with talking to each other, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to let you sort of see us out. What is your hope for the United States going into the future? We have right now a real issue with consciousness of racism in this country, but also the tendency to divide and subdivide in a way that dilutes power for progressive change, right? Progressive change basically meaning progress, right? I'm not talking about a political movement, I'm talking about progress.
Right.
So how do we move forward? What are your hopes for the next 5 years in terms of how the dialogue shifts in the United States, and what can each of us do to be part of that progress in America?
Yeah, my hope is that we all take this on as a personal challenge to learn and grow about each other, and to think about what kind of future do we want for our children? What kind of society are we building here? Is it one of inclusion? Is it one of, health and safety, where we have clean air and clean water, and where we have, people feel protected and safe? And, what are we going to do to break down the inequities? Because we have a challenge in our country. We're deep inequities. We're the biggest wealth gap just in the Asian American community alone. And so we have a responsibility to each other to make these changes. And it's not just an individual responsibility. We need to challenge our civic and political leaders. We need to challenge philanthropy, and we need to challenge the private sector and corporations. We all have a role to play in addressing these inequities.
It's such an important point. What you're saying is that all of us have a responsibility to think about what America is going to be about. What is America going to be about when it comes to wealth and wealth distribution, of opportunity and opportunity distribution, of race? You know, how do we see ourselves as having a common history and a common set of values, of rights, of freedom of speech, right? Every American ought to be talking to every other American about the future of the country, and we ought to become active in it. And part of this change is that white Americans should be thinking about Asian Americans, and Asian Americans should be thinking about Latin Hispanic Americans, and Latin and Hispanic Americans should be thinking about African Americans, right? How do you change ourselves to be the America we want to be?
Yeah, I mean, we actually have to work in partnership and in allyship with each other. And we have to, I mean, one of the basic things I've learned as a leader is one of the best things you can do is listen. So you have to step back and give people an opportunity to tell you their story and really deeply listen. And I think it starts there.
And deal with people's concerns, people who don't necessarily agree with you. I mean, that's part of it. Aarti Kohli, thank you so much for sharing the work that you do as Executive Director of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice and the Asian Law Caucus. Thank you all attendees for your questions and for your contributions. Everybody stay safe. Mask up. Mask up. We're close to the end of this COVID situation, as long as we can get our shots and as long as we protect ourselves and our families. Everybody stay safe. We'll see you on Thursday.